Everyone, good afternoon, good morning to our friends in Australia. It's a pleasure to have you here. I'm just going to get my notes here. I'm sorry for the delay. I'm Zev Yaroslavsky, and it's my honor to welcome you on behalf of the members of our America at a Crossroads leadership team, which alongside me includes former Congressman Mel Levine and Janice Kaminer-Resnick, who is traveling but will be back next week. I want to straighten out some possible confusion. Our program tonight will go from 5 to 6 o'clock. There was one announcement that we were going to go to 6:30. We are not going to 6:30 tonight, so it's the usual hour. And we appreciate your attendance tonight. We have a very large crowd. A warm welcome and many thanks to our frequent and one of our favorite guests, former Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis has served under 4 U.S. presidents and has an unparalleled diplomatic experience spanning over more than 40 years in the diplomatic field. Tonight's topic is statecraft, Donald Trump, the prospects for the Middle East, and U.S. foreign policy in 2025. This is sure to be an enlightening and timely important hour. Welcome to our extraordinary moderator, Larry Mantle, who yesterday celebrated his 40th anniversary of his iconic and award-winning public radio program, Air Talk, which, by the way, can be heard on LAist, formerly KPCC Radio, in Los Angeles. You can listen to his programs online live from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Pacific time, and they are also archived on the Air Talk website. A couple of notes on upcoming programs. Next Wednesday, April 9th, we'll be welcoming the Bulwark's dynamic and brilliant Sarah Longwell, together with the always interesting and energetic George Conway, former husband of Kellyanne Conway. Both Sarah and George have been leading commentators of the trajectory of our democracy, and they always have a lot of information and insights to share. They will be discussing Whither Goest Thou America? Hopes for the Future of Our Country, in conversation with Warren Olney. Be sure to sign up for all of our exciting April and May programs through the email you'll receive right after tonight's events. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the remarkable Larry Mantle. Larry is the host of NPR's Air Talk program, the preeminent Southern California radio talk program. He is a beloved institution in California and is also a Treasured America at a Crossroads regular moderator. Yesterday, I was honored to participate in Larry's radio program, a 2-hour testimonial to his 40-year run on public radio. 40 is a significant number in biblical scripture. Noah's flood lasted 40 days. Moses led the Israelites through the wilderness for 40 years and spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, twice. And to these, we now add Larry Mantle's leading his flock of listeners over the last 4 decades. Biblical indeed. We are so fortunate to have Larry Mantle as a regular moderator on our America at a Crossroads program. And Larry, congratulations to you, and the floor is now yours.
Zev, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And it was wonderful to have you part of our 40th anniversary program yesterday that we did in front of an in-person audience at our auditorium at our Pasadena, California studios. It was a day I will never forget. And Supervisor Yaroslavsky was the lead guest in our panel discussion on what's changed in Southern California over 40 years. And it was great, Zev, to have you as a part of that, such an important voice in Southern California. It's great to be back for America at a Crossroads, and particularly to talk with Ambassador Ross, a frequent guest on these programs and someone who provides so much insight into the complexities of the Middle East. I come to these programs having done, of course, research, looking at the latest news developments, trying to wrap my arms around the complexities of the region, only to have Ambassador Ross lay things out so cleanly, not necessarily with simple answers, because, of course, there aren't any, but I feel like I understand so much better what the moving parts of the crisis are, and I always appreciate that. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in the Middle East peace process for Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. He's authored 7 books on diplomacy, including his most recent, Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. He's not only a frequent guest on these programs, but network news shows, cable television news programs. He's quoted regularly in major American newspapers. Ambassador Ross, so good to have you with with us again.
Great to be with you, Larry. Thank you.
Israel's renewed offensive in Gaza includes, according to Israel's Defense Minister Israel Katz, the seizure of large areas for security zones. Katz wasn't more specific. We've heard Palestinians describe it as an Israeli land grab. Rafah in the south has been ordered to evacuate. The ceasefire is dead, at least for now. Are we back to square one in finding peace and freeing the last of the hostages?
I'm not sure. And I'm not saying that as a diplomatic answer. I'm genuinely not sure because I do think what we see right now is an Israeli policy that is designed to build pressure on Hamas, maybe also on Egypt as well. I think if we go back, if you take a look at Steve Witkoff's statement a couple of weeks ago, he said Hamas was playing for time. Steve Witkoff is the American negotiator on this issue, on Russia-Ukraine, on Saudi normalization, on Iran, on Paul Weiss and law firms. I mean, he is the all-purpose negotiator for President Trump. And he said a couple of weeks ago, in response to Hamas not having reacted, I think, well to a proposal he made, that Hamas was running out of time and there would be consequences for it if it did not respond to the proposal that he made. Now, I want to put this in some perspective. The ceasefire hostage deal that was touted by President Trump, and he took credit for it, and I would say deservedly so, because while Steve Witkoff and he did not negotiate the framework, which had really been worked out at the end of last May, both the Israelis and Hamas did not agree to that framework until right on the eve of the inauguration of President Trump. I think in the Israeli case, it was pretty clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu did not want to say no to Trump, and Trump was saying he wanted this done. And I think that both Qatar and Egypt had gone to Hamas and said, look, if the war stops, it'll be very difficult to resume it, so it's in your interest to do this as well. Trump's coming in. So I think that presence contributed to that framework. But that framework required, starting on day 16 of the first phase, there were 3 tranches of withdrawals, of releases. That framework said on day 16 of the first phase, the negotiations for phase 2 were supposed to begin. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu never began those, in no small part because his finance minister, Minister Smotrich, had made it clear if he agreed to phase 2, he would bring the government down. Now, simply negotiating on phase 2 didn't guarantee you were going to reach an agreement, but to remind everybody, phase 2 was to involve the negotiations for a permanent ceasefire, for an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and for the release of all the living hostages. Phase 3 was to begin reconstruction in Gaza and the release of the bodies of those hostages who were no longer alive. Now, there was never a readiness on Prime Minister Netanyahu's part to go ahead and negotiate phase 2. He didn't do it. He suggested instead an extension of phase 1 so that hostages would still be released. There would be a ceasefire. Steve Witkoff, when he felt that there was an impasse here that he couldn't bridge, he offered an alternative. The alternative was release 10 hostages, living hostages, have a 50-day ceasefire. The other half of the hostages could be released at the end of the 50 days. You would use the 50 days to try to negotiate an end to the conflict. So it was not the framework that had been negotiated. It was a variation of it. The Israelis accepted it. Hamas did not accept it. Hamas said, we will stick to the original agreement. Now, Hamas was obviously doing things in terms of how they did releases that looked like they were certainly not living up necessarily to everything the way it had been understood. But that was the Hamas position. Witkoff laid out, okay, you're playing for time. There's going to be consequences. You have an Israeli government now in which they're using force. Their argument, the prime minister says, we're prepared to negotiate. We're negotiating now, but we're going to put pressure on Hamas. And Hamas is saying, we will stick to the original agreement. Now they're putting out that they might be prepared to release five living hostages. There is an effort being made by both Egypt and Qatar. So I don't think that we're necessarily back to square one, but I think there's a basic gap here. And I do think
Yeah.
there's a point at which Steve Witkoff probably has to come in and play a more activist role.
Well, and what do you think that that role might look like? What sort of pressure do you anticipate the Trump administration is willing to apply to get a ceasefire that's operative again?
Yeah. Look, having written a book about statecraft, I think in terms of the key elements of it. If your objective is to end the war, what are your means for doing it? What is the leverage that we have? Leverage is key to effective statecraft. We have a lot of leverage on Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's very difficult for him to say no to President Trump. We have a lot of leverage on Egypt. Egypt wants to be in the good graces of President Trump. Egypt has more of an ability than anybody else, including Qatar, to put pressure on Hamas, because many of the released prisoners have come to Egypt, and Egypt has basically suggested that if they're not satisfied with Hamas, these Palestinian prisoners who were released as part of the earlier deal, they might put them in jail. So they have leverage on Hamas. We have leverage on Egypt. We have leverage on Israel. And I'll put this in a larger context. It's very clear that President Trump wants the Nobel Prize. He's not going to get the Nobel Prize for Russia-Ukraine because Europeans are not going to vote for him in the context of him putting pressure exclusively, it seems, only on Ukraine and not on Russia. But Saudi normalization is something he could get the Nobel Prize for if he produces it. But to get that, one of the things that's very clear is that the Saudis are saying, we will not do normalization unless the war in Gaza is over and Israel is out of Gaza. So if President Trump wants to get the Nobel Prize, he has to end the war in Gaza.
It's still, though, murky. Well, what does Gaza even look like after a ceasefire? Egypt proposed technocratic government be installed there. The Palestinian Authority, of course, is, as you know, you've spoken and written about so often, is in disarray. It's not trusted. There's corruption, of course, that's a part of it. So if Hamas is in fact institutionally to be removed, what reasonably replaces it? And where does the funding come from for rebuilding? And are Gazans, the residents, allowed to stay, or are they, you know, as President Trump wants to have them moved out while reconstruction occurs? What's realistic for the aftermath?
So there's a lot that you're asking in there. So I'm gonna drill down into different parts of the question, because the question gets to the heart of something fundamental. Even if you could end the war, if Israel's still in Gaza, there won't be Saudi normalization, but Israel will find it very difficult to ever get out of Gaza. And if it's in Gaza because there's no real answer to governance, that's a problem. If Israel gets out without an alternative to Hamas, then you'll have a vacuum where either Hamas comes back or you'll end up with Mogadishu on Israel's border. So either one of those is unacceptable. So there needs to be an alternative to Hamas, but there also needs to be an alternative to the Israelis. And the essence of this, I think, comes down to the following. A, Hamas as a military has already been defeated. One of the issues, that the problem that the Israelis never adopted the strategy that David Petraeus was suggesting very early on. He said one lesson we learned in Iraq, and we learned it the hard way, was you can't just clear an area and leave, which is exactly what Israel's done. You have to clear an area, you have to hold an area, and then you have to create security for that area and build in it. We know the UAE was prepared to contribute and be part of a stabilization force. We know if the UAE was prepared to do that, Egypt would also be there. We know that Morocco was interested in playing a role. Now, in the case of the UAE said, we will come in and we will play this role. We will help finance the role. And they have the means to do it. But we are not coming in unless there's also reform in the Palestinian Authority, because if we go into Gaza and there's no reform in the Palestinian Authority, there won't be a Palestinian alternative for governance to Hamas, and we'll be there forever. We're not signing up to go in there forever. So there actually were, before the end of the Biden administration, there were quiet negotiations between the Israelis and the UAE on terms for what Israel would accept. They would accept the idea that the Palestinian Authority they would be the party that would invite the UAE and others in. The Israelis were not accepting a role for the PA at this point. They didn't exclude the idea that if there was a reform PA, it could assume a role over time. The whole idea was to create an interim administration, not unlike what the Egyptians were suggesting in their plan. The Egyptians came with a plan that was designed to address what President Trump was saying. There's no way to do reconstruction in a place that's completely devastated. At least 70% of all the buildings are wholly or partially destroyed. You can't do it when you have 2 million people who are there. Egypt came with a plan that said, here's how you can do it. We will have safe areas for Gazans to move to. We will have reconstruction plans for the other areas. We will raise the monies for that. The Gulf states have said if this is credible from their standpoint, they will be prepared to invest in it. And Egypt was basically demonstrating you can do reconstruction without mass relocation. Now, the reality is, if there are Palestinians who would like to leave, they ought to be able to leave. You're not going to have 2 million Palestinians leave, partly because you're not going to have countries that are going to absorb or take in 2 million Palestinians. But if you ask me, might we see 100,000 Palestinians leave? Yes, I think that's a distinct possibility.
Let's talk though about the Trump administration's response. So Egypt and Emirates, are saying they would fund, they would create the safe zone. So what's the downside of that for the U.S.? I mean, the potential for the Trump administration to pressure Netanyahu to accept that. So, but let's take it from the U.S. perspective. What would be the downside of a plan like that?
So the problem with the Egyptian plan was not the reconstruction approach. There was a certain logic to the reconstruction approach. But the problem with the plan was it never mentioned Hamas, number one. It had no approach to dealing with the issue of demilitarization. There cannot be reconstruction in Gaza without demilitarization. There is an approach that could work, which gets back to what I was talking about with regard to the UAE. The UAE was going to come in with its own forces. By the way, the UAE has 4 bakeries on the ground in Gaza that it provides protection for, feeds 500,000 people every day. It has a field hospital that it provides protection for. The UAE is prepared not only to bring its own forces in, but also to bring in security contractors. So you need to integrate what the Egyptians were talking about with a clear plan for bringing in forces that would provide law and order, would distribute the humanitarian assistance to ensure it gets to what it's intended for, and prevents Hamas from doing what it's done. Hamas has seized the humanitarian assistance and then sold it. That's where it's been generating revenue. So this is a plan that could work. The Trump administration said the Egyptian plan was inadequate, said it would talk more with the Egyptians. There's not a lot of sign that it actually did talk more with the Egyptians. There should be a follow-up with the Egyptians. There should be a follow-up with the Emiratis, and there should be a follow-up with the Israelis. Right now, part of the problem is the Israelis still don't have a plan for what comes next. You asked the question about what the Israelis are doing. They're expanding the area in Gaza that's under their control. They're doing this primarily as a form of leverage on Hamas, but it also may end up becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where Israel is getting more deeply embedded in Gaza, which in the end is not going to solve the problem for Israel.
Yeah.
I want to say something that may seem paradoxical. The only time Hamas operatives are in uniform is during ceasefire, when they're releasing the hostages. Otherwise, they're not in uniform and they blend into the population. Israel would face an ongoing insurgency if it stays there.
Let's talk about the Trump administration, President Trump's motivations in your view. You said he clearly wants to win a Nobel Peace Prize and that bringing peace to the Middle East would be the vehicle for that. But do you think, based on what you've seen, that what the ultimate outcome looks like, does that matter to President Trump? Does he have a preferred outcome based on what you've seen with the pressure exerted by his administration?
He himself has said he's not sort of prejudging what the outcome is. When he was president the first time, he said one state, two states, whatever. But then, to be fair, in the Trump plan that was presented in January of 2020, it did provide for a Palestinian state. Now, it approached the state in terms of non-contiguous territory, but it was providing for a Palestinian state. So if he wants the Saudi normalization, the Saudi position is, we will do normalization with Israel. We can't do it as long as the Gaza war is going on. We can't do it as long as Israel's in Gaza, point one. Point two, we need a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. And point three, we want a defense treaty with the United States. So the Biden administration was prepared to do the defense treaty with Saudi Arabia. We've not heard President Trump on that. He's not exactly an enthusiast for alliances, so it's not a given that necessarily he would do that. But if he wants the deal, and this becomes what the Saudis require for it, my suspicion is he would go ahead. The issue of the issue of a credible pathway for a Palestinian state, the Saudis haven't necessarily defined what that is. That could be up to the administration to do it. I would say this: there are some things that we should be asking of the Saudis. If you say you want a credible pathway to a Palestinian state, unless the Saudis and the Arabs deliver reform in the Palestinian Authority, you're creating the basis for a failed state. So a credible pathway has to include reform on the Palestinian side. It also has to include some demonstrations on the Palestinian side that this is a state where independent militias will not be allowed. This is a state that won't align with Iran and rejectionists. This is a state that's built on the principle of coexistence, not resistance. But as you ask things of the Palestinians, you can't have the Israelis at the same time taking steps on the ground that make a Palestinian state impossible.
What do you think of the protests that we've seen against Hamas in Gaza? Is there anything approaching critical mass with those? Does it indicate the tide is turning in terms of popular support for Hamas?
I think there's very little popular support for Hamas. We've seen polls going back 2 months ago, and the two different ones that show 7% of the Gazans would like Hamas to remain in control. 7%. I think these demonstrations, they have been spontaneous. They were not, there wasn't some kind of inherent organization. There were a few people who began pushing for it, and there was responsiveness to this. It started in northern Gaza and spread throughout all of Gaza. Now, the Hamas then put to death 6 people they called collaborators. And will that, in fact, be something that, it creates the kind of intimidation that Hamas wants? Perhaps. You ask if there a critical mass. A critical mass would be something that has a life of its own. I'm not sure we're there. I will say this: I do think because of the demonstrations, there is a greater potential for Hamas to agree to a ceasefire soon, to come around on some of the terms that Wickoff was saying. In the current context, if they try to crack down on this, the Israelis may go after the people trying to crack down on it. In a ceasefire reality, it becomes easier for Hamas to go after those who might be protesting. So I actually think I don't see an end of the conflict ceasefire deal. I do see what may be a renewed ceasefire on a basis of for 40 or 50 days, with some of the hostages being released. The Hamas will not give up all the hostages. They're basically they see it as their main bargaining chip. And my guess is they're holding out to try to see an end to the war.
We have a listener, Mitch, who asked a question and wondering, once all the surviving hostages have been released, whenever that point comes, what would stop Israel from cleansing Gaza?
The answer is nothing, by the way. About close to 80% of the Israeli public would like the first priority to be get the remaining hostages out. The hostages who've come out, who've told their stories about the deprivation, the physical and the psychological torture, the starvation, the brutalization. These stories have moved the Israeli public to say that should be the first priority. And if there's agreement, sooner or later, Hamas will violate the agreement anyway, and then you can go back in. So that's where the body politic is. It's not where the Netanyahu coalition is. And that's, again, I think that's part of the issue at this point. What is it that Netanyahu is prepared to do? Right now, he's prepared to accept what was the Witkoff proposal that doesn't require ending the war, but it gets the essence of the Witkoff proposal is basically half the living hostages at the beginning of the ceasefire, and you try in the 50 days, although now they're talking 40 days, you try in the 40-day period to see if you can come to an agreement on resolving everything.
Barry, a viewer asks, what do you think of Netanyahu's ongoing dire legal situation? How does that factor in to reaching a substantive resolution on Gaza?
I think it's, I haven't always believed that it was fundamental in this regard. I've come to believe it more. This week, we saw a kind of extraordinary set of moves by the prime minister. The prime minister has been told that the Supreme Court has found that they want to make a decision before the firing of the head of Shin Bet can actually be implemented. Now, they did say he could begin to interview possible replacements, but they will not make a decision before next week on the validity of the process of firing the head of Shin Bet. He went ahead day before yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu went ahead the day before yesterday and announced at 6:40 in the morning that he had selected a retired Navy admiral to become the new head of Shin Bet. There was no rush to get that out. First of all, he'd been told he could interview, not that he could name a replacement. But it seemed clear that he was trying to preempt news about another scandal, what's known as Qatar Gate in Israel, where at least two members of the prime minister's office were receiving money from, at least indirectly, from the Qataris to try to create a favorable image for Qatar in Israel. It's not at all clear that the prime minister knew anything about this, but he seemed to know that this was going to emerge more, and it appeared that one of the reasons for rushing out with the name of a new head of Shin Bet was to have the media focus on that and not the Qatar Gate. Now, he did it so quickly that within the same day, he rescinded the announcement, and they rescinded the offer. He had extolled the great virtues of his appointment, and within the same day, I'm not talking 24 hours, we're talking within 12 hours, he rescinded it because he had written an article that was critical of Trump on the issue of environment and climate change, and B, he had apparently in 2023 he had taken part in some of the demonstrations against the judicial reform. So it's pretty clear the prime minister was rushing this out without the kind of vetting he would normally do, and you have to ask yourself the question, why would he rush it out this way unless he had other considerations?
David, who's watching, asks, what is the comparative degree of popularity in Israel between Netanyahu and Trump?
I think that Trump is more popular in Israel than the prime minister. The prime minister has a very solid base of about 30%, and they absolutely support him regardless. But you have a very clear majority that favors his leaving. Some say it should be immediate. Some say, okay, wait until the war is over. But today in Israel, it's pretty clear that Trump probably has more support than I think Netanyahu has. And by the way, Trump did not make it easier for Netanyahu when he said, a couple of weeks ago, he said all the hostages have to be released by Saturday. or else they'll be hell to pay. Well, he wasn't the one who was going to be inflicting the hell. And what the Israelis have done over the course of, almost a year and a half now, it's hard to understand what they haven't done militarily, what more they could be doing militarily, other than staying there. And yet, Bibi, subsequent to that, ended up accepting what was a continuing with phase one and continuing with what we're getting 8 more live hostages out. So in a sense, you had Trump go to Bibi's right. And yet here was Netanyahu. On the one hand, he knew if he could get 8 live hostages out, which Hamas was willing to do because it was part of continuing the first phase, for him not to do that would have produced an explosion in Israel. And yet here was Trump basically saying, they should all come out now or forget it. Now, it is not popular for him to have resumed the fighting right now, for having sent the IDF back in, again, because a significant majority of Israelis want the main priority to be the hostages. Get them out first. And the earlier question reflects what the mood is. No one believes that Hamas will live up to anything. Everyone believes Hamas will try to reconstitute itself and will engage in acts of violence and terror against Israel. And they feel, therefore, Israel will have a pretext to deal with Hamas after the hostages are out.
Let me just ask again for viewer questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask Ambassador Ross, please include your first name, if you wouldn't mind your location as well. And you can ask the question in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll share those with Ambassador Ross. Terry opines that the current U.S. administration is populated with reckless incompetence. Terry wonders, well, does Israel realize what kind of a partner it has in the U.S. government?
I think if you're sitting in Israel, there may be some questions about what's going on, especially when Israelis look at the treatment of Zelensky and Ukraine. It probably is not a source of great inspiration and reassurance. Having said that, Trump seems to fundamentally be supportive of the Israelis. You have a Trump administration when Israel acts in Lebanon because it sees Hezbollah acting in ways that's inconsistent with a ceasefire or preparing to do something, and Israel acts against it, the Trump administration supports it. And people compare that with, would Biden have been supporting this, or would Harris, if she were in, would she be supporting it? So they look at what seems to be a pretty basic support for the Israelis when it comes to everything that's going on around Israel. The public posture and anti-Semitism also seems to be strong. Actions against universities that haven't been prepared to protect students and perhaps the way they should have. There's a kind of collective sense that Trump right now is doing things that are good for Israel, but I do think there's an undercurrent of uncertainty about what he may yet do. And so while I would say he's more popular than Bibi, at this point, as I said, a majority of Israelis actually believe that the prime minister, that it's time for him to leave.
Cora in Los Angeles asks, how does Israel's aggression in the West Bank affect what's happening in Gaza?
It doesn't have much of an effect in Gaza. What Israel is doing in the West Bank, for the most part, is designed to ensure that Hamas doesn't gain a foothold there. Now, there's an issue. Israel can act in ways to try to stop acts of terror, but if it's also weakening the Palestinian Authority at the same time, it creates more of a vacuum that makes it easier for Iran and others to try to foment even more trouble within the West Bank and more trouble for Israelis. But right now, it's pretty clear Gazans want the war over because they're the ones who've paid a terrible price. People in the West Bank are obviously, this is not a simple reality for them. Emotionally, it's not simple, but also they're dealing with what is an increasingly difficult situation, in part because we've also had a couple of cases recently of very activist settlers going into Palestinian villages and and engaging in violence. And the IDF and the police have been slow to respond to that, in no small part because it appears this Israeli government in particular tends to create protection for them. One of the reasons that I think the head of Shin Bet was being fired was precisely because he was acting against them. And Minister Ben-Gvir had left the government over the issue of accepting this ceasefire, the hostage deal with the 3 phases that I mentioned. He's come back in because of the firing of Ronan Bar, the head of Shin Bet, and because of the resumption of the war. So, the reality is you have a government in Israel right now that is in many ways preoccupied with sustaining itself. It isn't to say that it doesn't want to deal with the threats, but it is clearly preoccupied with sustaining itself.
Joyce asks, do you think there's any validity in President Trump's vision of turning Gaza into a tourist Eden?
I've actually spent a lot of time in Gaza, and there is a lot of waterfront, there's no doubt, but it's also a completely impoverished place. Now it's a place that's largely devastated. What President Trump was outlining, if you were looking at this as a real estate problem and redevelopment, you would say, how can I do this with 2 million people there? This was not a political statement. It was a kind of practical statement. How are you going to reconstruct this place? The problem is Arabs and Palestinians looked at it as if it was an effort to solve the Palestinian problem by having all Palestinians leave. And they won't do that. There still is an attachment to the land. There would certainly be some who would be willing to leave if they had the chance, for sure. But the reality is Palestinians and Arabs will not look like they're trying to deal with the Palestinian issue by having Palestinians leave. Now,
what could garner investment then in Gaza if you had millions of Palestinians who stayed, if they're relocated to sort of a safe haven within the Strip? How would it be possible somehow to have investment that people would feel secure enough in putting money into building up Gaza economically?
Well, the answer, this comes back to where is Hamas? That's what it comes back to. The Trump administration, to its credit, is saying that at the end of the day, Hamas can't be in control in Gaza. And the truth is, I will tell you, the UAE has the same view. The Saudis have the same view. And they have that view because they know they'll be the ones who are asked to invest, and they're not going to invest if Hamas can make a comeback. Now, there are things that can be done even now to guarantee that they can't. The key to this is cutting off what I call the oxygen to Hamas. Number one, what does that mean? It means stopping all the smuggling from Egypt into Gaza. Egypt can shut down the smuggling, especially through Rafah. The administration can make it clear to the Egyptians, this is a test of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, number one. It can give them an incentive. They can take the lead in terms of the contracting for rebuilding in Gaza, which will be a huge economic boost to Egypt. But so number one is you have to stop the smuggling. This is how Hamas did 300 miles of tunnels. This is how it built a military industrial base underground. It could get whatever it wanted. So number one is you have to stop the smuggling. Number two, this was a mistake of both the Israelis and the Biden administration. It was right to push for humanitarian assistance, but you couldn't then say, okay, you must have humanitarian assistance, and then you had no responsibility for what happened after it went into Gaza. And Hamas seized it and sold it. This is how it sustained itself. So either we should have accepted the idea that we had to come up with a security approach on this, or the Israelis had to be responsible for distributing it.
Was there any way that the Israelis could have turned back Biden on that and said, no, we're not going to do that? Or was that just not realistically anything that Netanyahu could do?
It wasn't realistic for him. Look, he resisted because he was reflecting the mood of the Israeli public in the aftermath, of October 7th, but also the fact that the Red Cross had no access to any of the hostages. There was nothing that was going to the hostages. And most Israelis said, why should a humanitarian assistance be going in for Palestinians when not only have hostages been taken, but we have no notice, no visibility into the well-being of the hostages, no certainty that they're getting any treatment if they need it. Why can't the Red Cross have access to them? So maybe we condition humanitarian assistance on that basis. That was a very strong sentiment left to right within Israel. Bibi wasn't making up this, he was reflecting that mood. But Biden was saying, basically, what we provided to the Israelis under Biden was a huge amount of material, much more than people understand. They focus on, he restricted at one point 2,000-pound bombs going to Israel. But he's the one who went to the Congress for a $16 billion supplemental for Israel. And we provided huge amounts of material to the Israelis. And he was making pretty clear to Bibi, you don't do humanitarian assistance, that will affect what we will do for you.
Do we have a sense of how much of that assistance actually got to Palestinians in need, or how much was commandeered and used to support Hamas?
The majority of it was seized by Hamas. Now, by the way, they then sold it. So Palestinians, the people who could afford it, were getting it, and Hamas was using this to sustain itself. When I talk about cutting off the oxygen, there's three things you have to do. One, as I said, stop the smuggling. Two is make sure the humanitarian assistance goes to who it is intended to go to, and Hamas cannot touch it. And that requires forces to distribute it. And the third thing is, if you're going to have reconstruction, you come up with a mechanism to ensure there can be no diversion of materials. It goes for the express purpose. And here again, you have to have a presence that permits that. Hamas, under those circumstances, given how much it's been weakened as a military, it had 24 battalions. It doesn't have those anymore. It had an industrial base to produce drones, missiles, mortars, ammunition, anti-tank missiles. It doesn't have that anymore.
All right.
So if you choke off the oxygen, it can't rebuild itself. And this alternative, an interim alternative that is probably an Arab international with a Palestinian functional role, that maybe it's there for 2 years and you reform the PA, and the PA over a course of 2 years comes in. That is the answer here. And it's a much better answer for the Israelis.
Lisa, a viewer asks, is Israel now going to be reluctant to share intelligence with the U.S. after the Signal app, which is not fully secure, was used to share highly sensitive information?
It's a very interesting question. Signal is something that is encrypted. I would just say, to put this in perspective, this is not a secure device for classified information. Steve Witkoff was in Moscow at the time he was on this call. I can tell you, when I used to go to Moscow, when we would do secure calls, we had to go to a secure facility to be sure that what we were saying couldn't be intercepted. This was done in a way that, by definition, you could not guarantee the security of what was being discussed or transmitted in writing. So I would think it won't just be the Israelis, there'll be a number of allies who share with us very sensitive intelligence. I suspect that they'll be asking lots of questions. I don't think it's a given that it stops, that intelligence sharing is something that's also in the interests of the Israelis and other allies. But for sure, they'll want a reassurance about how classified material is going to be handled.
We're getting tight on time, and I have a couple more viewer questions. I wanted to ask you a little bit more details about your book, specifically Statecraft 2.0. But Catherine asks, if you were the lead negotiator for the Trump administration and you had wide latitude, how would you try to end the conflict? What would be the next couple of steps you would take?
What I would do is I would focus on the Saudis and the Emiratis on what they would be prepared to do if we can get the war to end. I would focus very heavily on what, in a sense, on their responsibilities here, especially the Saudis, if they want a credible pathway for a Palestinian state, what they need to be doing to help that. I would also deal with some of the Europeans who've been prepared to play a role, including on the issue of helping to ensure that one of the problems in Rafah, the Egyptians had very antiquated scanning technology. So we need to put sophisticated scanning technology into Rafah. I would focus very heavily on what forces the Emiratis and the Egyptians, maybe Moroccans, would be prepared to put into Gaza. I would work out a discussion between them directly and the Israelis over what they would need. How would you do a handoff between Israeli forces and forces coming in from the outside? I would want to be sure the Israelis that you had real mechanisms to ensure that there was absolutely a cutoff of all the smuggling. So this is there are multiple things you'd have to be doing at the same time, but ultimately it involves bringing together those Arabs who, by the way, have a huge stake in wanting to see the war end. As long as this goes on, it creates a pressure on them. We have two different realities in the Middle East right now. For Israelis, they don't focus. Their trauma means they see the pictures of the hostages and any soldiers they lose when it comes to Gaza. In the Arab world, the only thing they see is the death and destruction on the Palestinian side. It creates a pressure against Arab regimes, especially the Arab governments that are at peace with Israel. So they have an interest in seeing it end. Israel has an interest in seeing it end, so they get the hostages. And that gives you a strong convergence. It gives you something to work with.
Dennis, let's broaden it to talk about generally the art of statecraft, your book, and I believe it's a follow-up to the earlier book you did, Statecraft 2.0. So we're in a world now where the U.S. is not the lone superpower. China, of course, is extremely well armed, huge economy. We see Russia flexing its muscles with Ukraine and attempting to fend off the growth of NATO. So how should the U.S. government, in your view, navigate this? What are some of the areas of soft power and more assertive power, hard power, that the United States can exercise to try and keep peace in the world and try to protect American interests?
So I will do it in a way that sort of illustrates the point by giving an example. In effect, we've been talking about examples here. You just asked what we would do. The U.S. has hard power, it has soft power, it has alliances. One of the concerns I have about President Trump is he's dispensing with our soft power. What is soft power? Soft power is the source of attraction. When our objectives are embraced by everybody else, it makes it a lot easier not only to legitimize them, but to implement them. When you have partners who are prepared to play a role, whether it's in Gaza or to provide security assurances to the Ukrainians in the context of a peace deal. You take advantage of all your means, all your tools. Good statecraft is always characterized by marrying objectives and means. That means you have to define your objectives effectively, but it also means you have to realize what are the means we have on our own and what are the means we can mobilize from others. So let me give an example of this in Ukraine. We have a lot of leverage. Good statecraft is not just marrying objectives and means, it's basically mobilizing your means so you have leverage so you can affect the behavior of others. In Ukraine, the president talks about how much we've given Ukraine. We've given Ukraine $119 billion worth of economic and military support. Europeans have given $131 billion. That in itself demonstrates that that is a big addition to what we're doing. If you're going to affect Putin, you exercise real leverage on him. And he has vulnerabilities. What are the vulnerabilities? They have lost 700, 800,000 dead and wounded. They are losing 20 to 30,000 a month, either dead or wounded. They have a huge brain drain. They depend on North Korea for forces on the ground, the Iranians for drones and cruise missiles. They have 21% interest rates. They have double-digit inflation. If Putin understood that we were going to support Zelensky, if he doesn't make serious concessions, suddenly the idea that time is on his side disappears. If Ukraine is sustainable because we and others will help sustain them in the absence of Putin making reasonable concessions, then suddenly time is not on his side. You are not going to induce Putin to end this war. Inducement comes in, incentives come in the context where he's prepared to make hard decisions, and then you can make it easier for him.
Do you then, though, have to factor in, and I assume you do, American public sentiment, what voters think about that? So over time, we've seen Americans in conflict start tiring of it, questioning the expenditures of the money. Obviously, Republicans respond very differently to the question of supporting Ukraine than Democrats do on average. So how does a president effectively consider the duration and the degree of commitment and how the public responds?
Look, a major part of good statecraft is also how you frame issues publicly, partly to legitimize domestically, partly to legitimize internationally. President Trump's in a very good position. He's already demonstrated that he will play real hardball with Zelensky. We cut off for a period of time not only the assistance, but also intelligence. And that contributed to the Russians being able to take back most of the territory that the Ukrainians had seized within the Kursk salient. So he can say, look, here's what we've gotten the Ukrainians to sign up to. By the way, they accepted the temporary ceasefire. Putin hasn't done it yet. So he then explains, we've moved the Ukrainians, but the fact is the president of Russia has not been prepared to concede. One of the greatest forms of leverage that he has, and again, it depends very much on our allies. There are $300 billion in frozen Russian assets. We only have about 8 billion of that. The rest is in Europe. If President Trump were to say, if there isn't responsiveness by Putin, I will now support the Europeans turning over those frozen assets to the Ukrainians for reconstruction and rehabilitation. That's a form of leverage. When you're exercising statecraft, you're exercising all the tools you have. We have a lot of tools. We have a lot of means. We can mobilize from others. We have leverage on Putin. The president just isn't exercising it yet. He said he might, if Putin doesn't respond, he might do tariffs on those who buy Russian oil up to 50%. Okay, that's a form of leverage, but it pales in comparison to say, I'm going to support the Ukrainians if you're not prepared to accept a reasonable outcome.
Dennis, what is the risk of the United States going largely alone? I mean, you write, we've spent your whole career talking about alliances and how essential they are for even the strongest nation in the world. So what's the risk if the Trump administration doesn't turn to alliances?
Basically, we're alone then. And I'll tell you, sooner or later, there'll come points where we need some of those allies. And when we call, they won't pick up the phone. We'll be the loser in that. We're not the gainer in that. One of the things I describe in the book, there is a tradition in American foreign policy of unilateralism, not isolationism, unilateralism. President Trump reflects that tradition. We want freedom of action. We don't want obligations to others. We don't want to be limited. There is an element of that. But there's also a tradition, which he's not a part of, which emphasizes we do have values that matter. And democracies are natural partners. And when democracies are weakened internationally, sooner or later, we will be weakened internationally. I go through one of the chapters and I point out what are the debates over what America's role in the world should be. And the truth is, when you act unilaterally, you end up sort of looking at what might be spheres of influence, an approach to spheres of influence, which I think President Trump is sort of naturally drawn to. There's an inherent problem with spheres of influence. Where do they stop and where do they start and where do they stop? Do the Russians and the Chinese, are they satisfied with a certain sphere, or are they constantly going to keep pushing them out? Sooner or later, we will find we're in conflict with them. And so if you're in conflict, if you're competing with them, you're a whole lot better off if you have partners. I'll give you an example with China.
Yeah, real briefly, yes.
All right, very briefly. You look at India as a competitor of China, Japan and South Korea, Australia. If you want to be in a position where you have greater leverage on the Chinese, you want them to be part of your partners. With our allies, we control 60% of the GDP internationally. The Chinese control much less than that. That's a strength for us. It's not a weakness for us. So again, good statecraft focuses on how you expand the nature of your coalitions, not how you contract them.
We need to close, but I wonder if you would close with a thought that really struck me in your book. And I know it's not something new for you to say, but out in your view, the importance of a very strong United States in the world, that a powerful America actually makes for a better world. Because I think particularly there's some younger Americans who might bristle a bit at that. And but elaborate, if you would, in closing on why you think that that's important for everyone's benefit.
Generally, I can't say we've never made mistakes. Obviously, we have. And obviously, there have been times when we have overreached. But as a general rule of thumb, one of the interesting things about our alliances are voluntary. And even when we overreached, we didn't see our allies disappear because they understood, they too understood, we collectively are better off if there's a set of norms or rules internationally. And the one who's always been the key, President Obama used to say, and I often would describe him as an internationalist, but a minimalist. But he would say, if we don't organize to deal with certain threats or problems, nobody organizes to deal with them. It's just a reality that if the US doesn't play a role, you end up creating a vacuum. Others are not strong enough to do this on their own, especially if they don't think they have American support.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dennis Ross, author of Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Learn in a Multipolar World. And thank you for giving us a bit of the outline of the book, talking in depth about what's happening in the Middle East, the crisis in Gaza. Thank you so much, as always. It's wonderful to have you with us on these programs.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, and we ask you to please support these programs. This is a nonprofit organization, Jews United for Democracy, that put these on, Democracy and Justice, every week with America at a Crossroads. And you can go to the website, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. That's JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org to make your contribution to help keep these weekly programs coming your way. Next week, it's the Bulwark's Sarah Longwell and George Conway talking with Warren Olney at 5 o'clock Pacific. It's the typical day of the week and the typical time for the next America at a Crossroads. I'm Larry Mantle. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.